Baghdad accuses Riyadh of genocide, slamming the Saudis for supporting militants belonging to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Iraq's premier dismisses the country's top security commanders over recent militant advances as fierce battles for Mosul and Baquba continue to rage. And collective punishment. Israeli occupation forces detain hundreds of Palestinians in an apparent search for missing Zionist settlers. Hello there, you're watching AEE TV World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Baghdad has announced that it holds Saudi Arabia responsible for financing militant groups in Iraq. The statement issued by Prime Minister Nouri al-Malki's office denounced Riyadh for the crimes being committed by ISIL militants pillaging Iraq. The statement went on to say, "We hold Saudi Arabia responsible for supporting these groups financially and morally. The Saudi government should also be held responsible for the outcome of their actions, which include crimes that may qualify as genocide, the spilling of Iraqi blood, the destruction of Iraqi state institutions, and historic and religious sites." The Iraqi premier has dismissed several senior security commanders in a major shake-up of the military. Those dismissed included the top commander of the northern province of Nainawa, the first to fall in the recent ISIL assault. Maliki also ordered that one of the officers he fired face court-martial for desertion. The dismissals came after soldiers and police fled en masse as insurgents swept into the country's second city of Mosul, abandoning their equipment and uniforms. A series of bombings in the Iraqi capital Baghdad has left over a dozen people dead and nearly 50 others wounded. This as Iraq's police discovered the bodies of 18 security personnel with gunshot wounds to the head and chest north of the capital. In the deadliest attack, a car bomb exploded in a market in Baghdad's southern city, killing at least 14 people and wounding more than 30. Meanwhile, militants have made gains in the town of Tal Afar while capturing a border crossing with Syria as fighting over the country's second city of Mosul rages on.
The war to eradicate extremist militants from Iraq has spread across more cities over the past 24 hours. The main battle is continuing around the northern city of Mosul. The army besieged the capital of Nainawa province, and the Air Force bombarded positions held by militants belonging to the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. In the city, the extremists killed at least 21 soldiers who refused to pledge allegiance to them. In the central city of Tikrit, ISIL launched a series of mortar shells on various neighborhoods in response to rapid advances by the Iraqi army. The extremist group also took control of Al-Qaim, the Iraqi side of a border crossing with Syria, after security forces withdrew. The militants also seized parts of a Shiite majority town in northern Iraq, in fighting that has killed dozens of civilians and combatants. Security forces and civilian fighters still hold most of Tal Afar, including its airport. At least 50 civilians were killed in the clashes, which began at dawn, along with dozens of militants and members of the security forces. Security officials in the city said between 500 and 700 militants were involved in the assault. Tal Afar sits along a strategic corridor to Syria, and ISIL considers it key to its plan to create an Islamic State spanning across Iraq and Syria. Another city that saw a return of fighting is the capital of Diyala province, Baquba, just north of the capital, Baghdad. Militants attacked and took control of parts of the city, but security forces eventually repelled the assault. If Baquba were to fall, the next target would have been Baghdad. As a precaution, the military have over the past few days barricaded the capital to prevent any such advances. But the army's presence on the streets of Baghdad has not eased the worries of the capital's residents.
We're a little bit worried because of some of the news channels reporting inaccurate news that questioned Iraqi army capabilities. Such rumors being broadcast will have a negative effect on Iraqis.
After swift gains last week by the Al-Qaeda offshoot, including two provincial capitals, Mosul and Tikrit, the advances toward Baghdad has been halted by the Iraqi army, which has regrouped after the initial setback. Now the counter-offensive to root out ISIL is escalating, with many tribes joining forces with the government.
Meanwhile, US President Barack Obama has announced that up to 275 military personnel will be deployed to Iraq in light of the recent advances by the ISIL. The troops will provide support and security for US personnel and the country's embassy in the capital, Baghdad. This as Washington mulls drone strikes against militant positions in Iraq as it deploys warships in the Persian Gulf. Ankara said it has evacuated its consulate in the southern Iraqi city of Basra, adding that its diplomatic staff was taken to neighboring Kuwait due to security concerns. Turkish Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu stated that the Turkish consulate general was evacuated due to the heightened security risk in the Basra region. This comes a week after ISIL militants attacked its mission in Mosul and kidnapped several dozen Turkish nationals. Well, with Kirkuk now in the hands of the Kurds, another conflict is brewing in Iraq as tensions escalate between the Iraqi Turkmen Front and the Kurdistan regional government. The Turkmens have threatened to take the city back by force if it is not returned to the central government.
The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant may be in control of a number of cities in Iraq, but many are more frustrated about Kirkuk being in the hands of the Kurds. Kurdish forces seized control of the city on June 12th, following the complete withdrawal of the Iraqi army in the face of rapid advances by ISIL militants. The city was the center of disputes between the Kurdish regional government and Baghdad, and the Iraqi Turkmen Front is now concerned that the Kurds will not return the oil-rich city after capturing it. Already troops of a new Turkmen militia have been mobilized in the city, and according to the president of the Iraqi Turkmen Front, if the Kurdish Peshmerga forces refuse to return Kirkuk to the Iraqi government, they won't hesitate to fight back. For its part, the parliamentary speaker of the Kurdish regional government said that the KRG has no plans to hand back control of Kirkuk. Kirkuk has been extremely important to the Kurds both culturally and economically. Large oil reserves in the region of Kirkuk are a major factor in the dispute over control of the city. Its residents are a mix of Kurdish, Arab, Turkmen, and Assyrian populations, and are frequently subject to attacks carried out by militant groups, which have been exploiting the ethnic tensions to strengthen their hand on the ground.
Political analyst Dr. Ahmed Musalli joins us now from our Beirut studios. Dr. Musalli, this is Maliki's strongest accusation to the Saudi kingdom yet. How much of a hand does Riyadh have in ISIL's recent advances in Iraq?
Well, in terms of the major supporter of ISIL, it's definitely Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia in the last few years have been very unhappy with the political development in the area, where it has seen that it is losing its geopolitical clout in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and so forth. So this comes along within the same plan for Syria and what has happened there. And what we are seeing now is a similar scenario that being played out in Iraq, where different factions are now supported by Saudi Arabia, including ISIL and the Iraqi Islamic Army. Supposedly, it's not Islamic in the Islamist sense. It is a Ba'athist army headed by Izzat al-Duri and other smaller groups. And this is why we see not only the numbers we have seen in Iraq that have swept through cities are not only the ISIL people, but rather a lot of them are Ba'athist groups. So there is now really, unfortunately, again, the attempt to bring up the fight within Iraq along sectarian line, and the ISIL is a catalyst for that.
Yes, but Saudi Arabia shares a huge northern border with Iraq. Doesn't it fear ISIL coming to its doorsteps?
Well, again, I think Saudi Arabia believes that it can stop them somewhere. And if they can establish their caliphate in, or their state in Iraq, Syria, and as we have said here many times, in Lebanon, northern Lebanon, Tripoli in particular, maybe they think that would be the area where all the radical jihadists, Wahhabis and Salafis could be lodged. And what we are seeing now really is a very real attempt to establish that state and to divide Iraq into three major areas: a Sunni area in the north, and another one next to it, the Kurdish area, and then a Shiite a state in the center and the south. Hopefully this will not work, and the ISIL and its affiliate groups, whether nationalist or whatever they are called now, they will not be able to do it. Now, Saudi Arabia does have concern, of course, with these people, but I think their concern with Iran and the rise of Iran and the ability of the axis of resistance to negotiate with the US and the world power over nuclear issues and others, I think bothers Saudi Arabia more than the ISIL, which can be shut off by stopping sending money and so forth.
Yes, now Kurdish Prime Minister Nurchivan Barzani is now calling for an autonomous region for the Sunnis. Do you think that that was the plan all along, to divide Iraq and weaken the central government?
Well, definitely. I think now we are in the danger of establishing three states or dividing Iraq, but that will not only be kept in Iraq. I think that will split all of the Arab East and beyond, probably also may lead to a lot of different kind of uprising in the Gulf as well. So the Kurds in particular, I think they are keen on establishing their Kurdistan. And this, I think, will make the fight against the ISIL and other separatists easier, because then Turkey could join Iran and Iraq and Syria in fighting these groups. We may see this coming in the very coming days with the support of the US, which now at this point in time have not accepted the deal to divide Iraq into different and separate groups for different geopolitical reasons. If you want me to talk about, I'll be happy to.
All right, thank you for speaking to Ali Tijah, Professor at the American University of Beirut, and political analyst Dr. Ahmed Musalli.
Sure.
The violence in Iraq has forced more than 300,000 people to seek refuge in the Kurdistan region of the country, forcing the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, to build temporary camps for internally displaced Iraqis who have fled the deadly attacks committed by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in the northern city of Mosul.
Fearing for their lives, these Iraqis have left their homes and headed to northwestern Mosul. They have found refuge in Al-Qush, near the city of Duhok, where the village's Kul is now housing around 150 people. For most of the refugees here, leaving their homes was their only option.
My children were all crying and frightened as they did not want to leave the house. Some of them were sick. They could not even walk, but we had to leave.
Others, like this man, thought something like this would never happen to him.
I'm telling you, there's nothing worse than being a refugee and being forced to leave everything behind. Everything I ever had is gone. It's not just me. The future of my children has gone as well. They will have to start from scratch. They have nothing left. Our previous life is gone.
However, for the hundreds of those who could not find alternative shelter, they now reside in the Garmawa makeshift camp, which was erected nearby. Situated close to the road connecting Mosul and Duhok, the camp is just one of the locations where displaced Iraqis have found a safe haven. There, the United Nations Refugee Agency has provided 1,000 tents, as well as essential relief items. While it provides somewhere to rest, some refugees say there is no respite for facing the reality of what they have lost.
We were not rich, but nor were we poor. We used to live in a rented house. We had a good day-to-day life. We had breakfast together every morning, but now my family is torn apart.
Thousands of other Iraqis share similar stories, all of which are in desperate need of emergency support, with international organizations struggling to cope with the massive influx of refugees.
Have space for 1,000 tents, but for the moment about 400 or 300 tents have been erected. There are already 9 families in the camp who could not find shelter anywhere else within the whole governorate with their relatives or friends.
Since the violence in the north of the country erupted, an estimated 500,000 people have been internally displaced, most of whom have headed to the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
Israeli occupation forces have detained 200 Palestinians in the West Bank since Friday, as the Zionist regime continues its vast search operation for free settlers and collective punishment of Palestinians in the process.
200 Palestinians have been detained so far by Israeli occupation forces, as thousands of Zionist soldiers turned their attention to the northern West Bank city of Nablus and the surrounding area, detaining 41 Palestinians, with most of the detained belonging to Hamas. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had accused resistance fighters from Hamas of kidnapping the 3 settlers last week. Hamas dismissed Israeli accusations against it as being, quote, foolish. The Zionist regime has held Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas responsible for the safe return of the 3 settlers, with Netanyahu calling Abbas on Monday to demand his help in the search efforts in what was their first direct political contact since 2012. This while a series of punitive steps aimed at decapitating Hamas in the West Bank were discussed on Monday by ministers at an Israeli cabinet meeting. The ministers examined the possibility of banishing Hamas's senior members to Gaza and demolishing their West Bank homes. The official Israeli military spokesman, Lieutenant Peter Lerner, said, "As long as our boys remain abducted, Hamas will feel pursued, paralyzed and threatened." Echoing that sentiment, the former Israeli War Minister Shaul Mofaz called for the expansion of the Israeli operation in the West Bank and the detention of thousands of Hamas affiliates. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the Israeli Air Force carried out a 4th straight night of airstrikes. In response, resistance fighters fired more rockets into the occupied territories.
For its part, Iran has denounced the Israeli regime's latest airstrikes on the Gaza Strip and the abduction of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, urging firm international action to stop Tel Aviv's crimes. Iran's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Marzia Afkham, called on regional and international institutions to condemn the inhuman and aggressive moves by the Israeli regime against Palestinians. You're watching Ali Tijah World News, still to come.
The United Nations Human Rights Council is holding its 26th session here in Geneva, with Bahrain as its dominant feature.
Welcome back to AEE TV World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Baghdad accuses Riyadh of genocide, slamming the Saudis for supporting militants belonging to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Iraq's premier dismisses the country's top security commanders over recent militant advances as fierce battles for Mosul and Baquba continue to rage. And collective punishment. Israeli occupation forces detain hundreds of Palestinians in an apparent search for missing Zionist settlers. The fifth and crucial round of nuclear negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 group entered a second day, with all sides reportedly closer to a draft agreement that will lay the groundwork for a comprehensive deal on Tehran's nuclear energy program.
Inside the balcony of this hotel in Vienna, top negotiators from Iran and 6 world powers are convening again. The aim is to build on previous breakthroughs and pave the way for a landmark deal over Tehran's nuclear energy program. All sides have so far stressed that this is not far-fetched. A US source said that work on a draft text has already begun and that it was very likely that consensus will be reached before the looming July 20 deadline. On the eve of the talks, a trilateral meeting between Iran's Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and representatives from the EU and the US was held. Finding ways to bridge the remaining differences was the main topic of discussion. Zarif said the next step would be to start compiling a comprehensive text. But before the dotted line is penned, sticking points still have to be resolved. The West claims that Iran has to slash the number of centrifuges and dedicate its nuclear activities purely to peaceful purposes. The Islamic Republic has always confirmed its commitment to this condition, demanding in return that sanctions imposed against its economy are lifted, so that a new chapter of relations with the West can begin.
British Foreign Secretary William Hague has announced that the UK intends to reopen its embassy in the Iranian capital as West steps up its engagement with Tehran amid recent militant advances in neighbouring Iraq. Hague stated that the circumstances were right to reopen the embassy in Tehran with a small initial presence as soon as practical arrangements were made. The move comes following an improvement in bilateral relations in recent months after a suspension of full diplomatic relations since the attack on the British embassy back in 2011. Dr. Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University, joins us now from the Iranian capital. Dr. Marandi, Secretary Hague said the circumstances were right to reopen their embassy in Tehran. What are these circumstances?
It seems that the British government, along with many other Western governments, are recognizing the fact that the balance of power is shifting across the globe. The United States is having great difficulty with China over the South China Sea, with Russia. Also, the United States and its allies are struggling over Ukraine, and now we see that extremism is spreading across the West Asian region, and this is causing grave concern in Western countries. Iran, of course, is the only stable, completely stable country in this part of the world, and I think countries like Britain are recognizing the need to develop better ties with Iran. Of course, at the end of the day, the only way to have completely evolved ties with Iran that are completely normalized is if the United States and Iran come to an agreement over the nuclear program, whereas Iran's full rights are restored, because as Iran has stated repeatedly, it will not accept any long-term limitations on any aspect of its peaceful nuclear program. So it seems that Western countries are beginning to understand more than before the need to have stronger relations with Iran as the situation across the globe and the region changes, but I still think we have a far way to go.
So will we see Washington ever follow suit to the UK and reopen its embassy in Tehran?
One day that may be a possibility, but I doubt that would happen anytime soon. The problems between Iran and the United States are much more complex. Britain isn't a very important country in global politics, but the United States is a country that has repeatedly threatened Iran with military action. It has imposed unilateral and illegal sanctions on the country and hurting ordinary Iranians. And of course, the United States is responsible for the rise in terrorism and extremism in Iraq and Syria from the Iranian perspective through its unholy alliance with Saudi Arabia. So the Iranians have many grievances, and also, of course, the Iranian nuclear program is a key issue. The Iranians, under no circumstances, will allow nuclear apartheid to be implemented, as the Iranian president has said. So unless the United States comes to recognize Iran's full rights within the framework of international law with regards to the nuclear program, it starts dealing with regimes like Saudi Arabia and preventing it from exporting extremism and terrorism, and the United States remove the sanctions and the illegal sanctions, the sanction regime. Until these things happen, normalization really is not something possible, but I do believe that people in Iran believe that the United States is beginning to understand the importance of Iran and that the United States needs Iran more than Iran needs the United States.
Yes, now Iran still has different interests, and it's clear it's being illustrated in Syria. How can the UK, for example, overcome these differences with Tehran?
Well, the problem really is that the United Kingdom and France and Germany, which are the main powers in the EU, are themselves more or less client regimes, and they are unable to forge an independent foreign policy of that of the United States. So, for example, in the P5+1 negotiations, the Iranians have started to negotiate with Americans separately because they've seen and they've come to the conclusion that it is really the Americans that are important. And if the Americans make a decision, ultimately the French, British, and German governments will fall in line. But of course, the Iranians also have interests in better relations with England. But as I said, it's not really it is not nearly as important as Iran's relations with countries like China or Russia or the United States or India, for that matter.
All right, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this, Professor at the Tehran University, Dr. Mohammad Marandi. Amid the rising tensions between Washington and Moscow over the crisis in Ukraine, a US-guided missile destroyer arrived at the Spanish naval port of Rota on Monday. The USS Ross is the second of 4 US Navy destroyers to be deployed to the station. The destroyers are considered to be the cornerstone of NATO's European missile system, which Moscow has criticized as a direct threat to its security. Meanwhile, the latest round of shelling by troops loyal to Kiev in eastern Ukraine has claimed the lives of 2 Russian journalists. The recent violence comes amid a worsening security situation in the country and diplomatic efforts that have seemingly reached a dead end.
Tensions are on the rise in troubled Ukraine, as unprecedented military shelling on the restive region of Luhansk has killed 2 Russian journalists and sparked an international outcry over the crime caught on tape. Reporter Igor Kornelyuk and sound engineer Anton Voloshin both appear in video footage showing the exact moment when the first barrage of fire hit. They tried to take cover, but they both died of wounds sustained during the shelling. Moscow, for its part, condemned the killing of the two Russian television journalists in Ukraine, blaming Kiev's authorities and calling for a thorough investigation. This incident was not the only distress for Ukrainians, as reports surfaced of an explosion, which apparently ripped through a gas pipeline in the central Ukrainian Poltava region. Witnesses say that flames from the blast rose as high as 200 meters. Meanwhile, on the political front, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged the pan-European security body, the OSCE, to put pressure on Kiev to implement a roadmap for de-escalating the unrest.
Unfortunately, the Ukrainian authorities are so far refusing to support the roadmap, so all the OSCE members must influence Kiev in order to withdraw those objections.
Earlier, Ukraine's Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk hinted as to what Kiev's response to any Russian proposal may be.
Ukraine is an independent state and it's not up to Russia to determine our way, because we are moving towards the European Union.
For now, the bloodletting and Kiev's so-called anti-terrorist operation in the east looks set to continue unabated, despite calls from the international community and Moscow for an immediate end to the bloodshed.
Well, as Kiev steps up its so-called anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine, residents of Slavyansk are forced to decide whether to live amid shortages and frequent firefights or flee their ravaged city.
The situation in eastern Ukraine is not getting any better, with authorities in Kiev intensifying their so-called anti-terrorist operation with complete disregard for the well-being of the civilian population. Faced with ongoing shortages, utility outages and frequent artillery fire, some residents in the eastern city of Slavyansk are trying to go about with their daily lives despite the hardships.
This is how we live, what we worked for. What are they doing in Kiev? Those leaders should be swept out. Why are they torturing people? There's no water. There's no electricity. That's why we're coming for water.
In the city center, people boarded up shop windows scarred during recent artillery attacks, while stalls at the market sold few supplies. The ongoing conflict has made even the most essential tasks insurmountably hard.
I can't even bury my uncle right now. It's not clear whether they'll let us out or not. They were shooting the entire night. Where are you shooting? What are you doing?
Others in Slavyansk could not stand the faltering situation and have decided to leave.
They aren't paying pensions. They're not giving chill payments. You can't buy anything in the stores. Money we have been holding on for so long. We don't have money to buy food. That's why we are leaving.
Since April, the city has been the epicenter of pro-Russian separatist activity after gunmen seized government and police buildings. Ukrainian forces have surrounded Slavyansk and engaged in firefights with separatists. Now, what is left for residents here is to decide whether to live with hardship or leave what they once called home.
Egypt's new cabinet, headed by Ibrahim Mahlab, has been sworn in a ceremony and attended by the new president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The cabinet, which includes 34 ministers, is set to start working immediately, with promises of an energetic and better coordinated government. Our Cairo correspondent Karim Azzuddin has the details.
This is Egypt's third cabinet since former Islamist President Mohamed Morsi's ouster nearly a year ago, and the first under new President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi since his landslide election victory last month.
I hope the new government would make brave and quick decisions and avoid false promises that won't be fulfilled.
The government priority should be the youth. The youth should feel the change. I myself, as a representative of the country's youth, can't feel any change.
Egypt's Prime Minister Ibrahim Mahlab, a veteran politician who was serving as Egypt's interim Prime Minister during Hosni Mubarak's government, took the oath of office along with his new ministers at an early morning ceremony at the presidential palace in Cairo. The new government retained key economic and security ministers, but created a new investment post to attract funds to an economy racked by years of political turmoil. Mahlab's new government of 34 ministers has seen the appointment of 13 new ministers, with 4 women and several technocrats. A former ambassador to Washington, D.C., Sameh Shukri, has been appointed the post of foreign minister, and banker Ashraf Salman has been assigned the newly created investment portfolio. The fresh lineup retained most ministers from the previous government, including Interior, Defense, and Finance.
This government's main concern should be those who live on the minimum wage, those who were affected by the revolution. Unemployment should be a priority as well, in addition to security, because without security there would be no investments or tourism.
Sisi has promised to place security and restoring the country's struggling economy at the top of his agenda, and has pledged to build a more stable future after 3 turbulent years since the toppling of longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak. The general mood in Egypt seems optimistic over the new government. Meanwhile, demands of a strong government that can tackle the country's major issues, namely the skyrocketing unemployment rate, the lack of security, and the country's foreign relations, still persist. Reporting for Litiga TV from Cairo, Karim Ezzeddin.
US troops reportedly captured a Libyan militant accused of orchestrating the September 11, 2012 terrorist attack against the American consulate in Libya's Benghazi. The Washington Post reported that US Special Forces captured Ahmed Abu Khattala, the senior leader of the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Ansar al-Sharia militant group, following months of coordination with agents of the FBI. Khattala was accused of killing US Ambassador Chris Stevens as well as 3 others. Well, the UN Human Rights Council is holding its 26th session in the Swiss city of Geneva, where ongoing human rights abuses by the Bahraini monarchy have become a dominant feature. The session, which kicked off on June the 10th, will last until the 27th of the month. Various meetings calling for an end to human rights violations in Bahrain were also held on the sidelines of the session as the brutal crackdown continues against pro-democracy demonstrators in the Persian Gulf Kingdom. Our senior correspondent Hassan Al-Khatib joins us now from the Swiss city of Geneva, where the session is being held. Hassan, how much has the Bahraini plight been of concern during this session?
Very much so. I think the Bahraini human rights organizations have been present here, and their delegations have come over here from Bahrain, and we're expecting to see more coming over to Geneva, and they've been hosting events with other international human rights organizations, NGOs, who have put Bahrain, particularly on the 19th, and then 2 days to come, there'll be a special event then. But so far, since the beginning of this particular session, which started around the 9th or the 10th of June and will finish on the 27th. There's been a lot of events here, also talking about Bahrain as well. And just to give you an idea of how much support there is from the international community for the Bahraini people's right to self-determination, and also to try and stop these oppressive military violence against them, to stop the Bahraini regime from committing human rights violations. The event that will be taking place on the 19th will, have a lot of organizations such as the Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain. There's the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy. There's the Freedom House, Reporters Without Borders, Amnesty International and many others who will be present at that event. And it has taken some time now. 3 years since the uprising has happened, and ever since then, the Bahrainis have been under a lot of human rights abuses. And there has been international pressure in the past to try and get the Bahraini regime to implement some of the reforms in order to prevent some of these abuses to happen, and we've not really seen any significant move to do that. So in this particular session, there's been an acknowledgement, that's number one, that on the one hand, there are a lot of human rights abuses and the Bahraini regime isn't doing anything about it. And so there needs to be, if you like, steps towards implementing some of those very points that were made in multiple reports, such as the Basuni report, for instance, and even within the Human Rights Council, there were also strong condemnation of what the Bahraini regime continues to do, and also a very bold statement, a joint statement made by the 47 member states of the United Nations Human Rights Council, saying that they are seriously concerned about the situation in Bahrain, and that they really do want to see the situation improving itself, because at the moment they're just seeing that the Bahrain regime is carrying on with what it's doing and isn't implementing any of the reforms that were that were given to it by not just the international community, but also human rights organizations and NGOs. And of course, talks are still going on. One of the biggest breakthroughs we've seen in this session was how delegates from Al-Wafaq party, the Bahraini opposition party, and also human rights organizations representing the Bahraini people coming into contact with the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights, Navi Pillai, and holding a meeting with her, saying that there was a lot of positives from that meeting, and they're hoping more of this can happen and more pressure can be put onto the Bahraini regime.
Yes, so Hassan, is there hope among the opposition groups that were attended, like the Al-Wifaq you just mentioned there, that some of the rhetoric will go beyond condemnations and beyond acknowledgement of what is going on in Bahrain?
Well, of course, I put this to them and I said, well, it's all very easy to try and set up meetings and talk about the deteriorating situation in Bahrain. Of course, well, we have to acknowledge that is a good step and a very positive step. But the main thing is what will happen, what will really happen towards what is going on in Bahrain. Is it going to stop, prevent some of these human rights violations from happening? And of course, they are wary. They do understand that United Nations Human Rights Council is limited in a certain sense, but of course they are hopeful. They don't always talk about whether or not massive changes are going to be made, but what they are hopeful and what they have been seeing, and they have seen positive steps, and that's what they've told me. They've said we've been doing various things. Bahrain is now being mentioned more times than previous sessions in the United Nations Human Rights Council. That's a positive step, and I think a lot of NGOs and human rights organizations are supporting the Bahraini people. So they are seeing many positive steps being taken, and I think they want to continue that and develop that further. And that's, I think, their main goal in this session and in future sessions.
All right, Hassan Al-Katib, our senior international correspondent from Geneva, thank you. Fierce infighting has erupted between militants from the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and other Takfiri militant groups operating in Syria. This as the Syrian army continues to advance on the outskirts of the capital, Damascus.
Following a breakdown in negotiations between the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and other extremist militant groups, a new wave of Takfiri infighting is underway, namely in the oil-rich province of Deir ez-Zor. Blasts went off in Deir ez-Zor's Shmariye village as ISIL militants targeted militant brigades and their Al-Qaeda-affiliated Al-Nusra Front allies in the eastern province, killing 6 militants. ISIL militants also engaged in armed clashes with Kurds affiliated with the Kurdish Democratic Union Party in the Tel Tamer region located in Syria's northeastern province of Al-Hasaki. According to U.S. officials, ISIL has moved seized weapons from Iraq to Syria, said to include Russian-made T-55 tanks, and numerous U.S.-made Humvees were shown on flatbed trucks being transported from the Nineveh province in northwestern Iraq to ISIL-controlled areas of Syria, including the Al-Shaddadi area and the town of Tel Hamas. Meanwhile, Syrian army units have thwarted an infiltration attempt into Al-Ramuse neighborhood in Syria's second city, Aleppo. Units of the armed forces repelled the attack and inflicted hefty losses on foreign-backed militants, which led to the death and injury of several gunmen. Army units are also advancing in the Damascus countryside, which witnessed heavy clashes that began earlier this month. Fighting in the eastern Ghouta area has also intensified as the army managed to push back fighters affiliated to several extremist groups active in the area, killing and injuring scores of militants. For many Syrians now, the recent lightning offensive by ISIL in Iraq has raised concerns of further mayhem spreading across neighboring Syria as fears mount over the new arsenal seized by ISIL, which is expected to cause further bloodshed in an already war-ravaged country.
Here's a reminder of tonight's top stories. Baghdad accuses Riyadh of genocide, slamming the Saudis for supporting militants belonging to the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Iraq's premier dismisses the country's top security commanders over recent militant advances as fierce battles for Mosul and Baquba continue to rage. And collective punishment, Israeli occupation forces detain hundreds of Palestinians in an apparent search for missing Zionist settlers. Well, that's all from me and the Al Ijah News team. Thank you for watching and good night.